Political advertising is as much a part of American culture as apple pie. From the bland but catchy slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, which we all learned in high school, to the progressive movement's cartoons of Tammany Hall boss Tweed, political ads have been a part of the American political landscape since the earliest days of the Republic. And it was a fairly peaceful landscape until television came along. And TV political ads have been with us now for more than half a century, believe it or not, starting with Eisenhower, who, I did a little research, who hired the Madison Avenue ad man who persuaded kids of my generation to believe, contrary to our experience, that M&Ms would melt in your mouth, not in your hand. He went on to a great career as Eisenhower's TV spot person. But it wasn't until the Kennedy-Nixon campaign of 1960 that television really took off and became the major forum for presidential politics. It has been ever since. And it was in 1960 that negative ads made their debut. Kennedy, for example, got a boost from an ad that we'll screen for you later, showing Eisenhower at a press conference responding to a question about what major ideas Richard Nixon had contributed as vice president. In a famous reply, Eisenhower said, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." Perfect material for a Kennedy campaign TV spot, and very accurate in the sense that it was spoken by President Eisenhower. Today, we're going to take a close look at political advertising, how it's done, how it's changed over the years, and how it affects our democracy and the way people participate in it, or, unfortunately, too often these days don't participate, and how they make their decisions about candidates. To help us do that, we have an all-star panel of experts whose names are as well known as the candidates they've written about or worked for. David Broder, to my immediate left, is one of America's most respected national political writers. His syndicated column for the Washington Post is carried twice a week by more than 300 papers in the U.S. and around the world. A Pulitzer Prize winner for his distinguished commentary, David was rated, and I quote, Washington's most highly regarded columnist in a survey by the Washingtonian magazine of editorial page writers, editors, and members of Congress, leading all others for, quote, overall integrity, factual accuracy, and insight. He has won numerous awards for his political writing and is a frequent commentator on CNN's Inside Politics, NBC's Meet the Press, and Public Broadcasting's Washington Week in Review. Mark Shields is a national columnist and commentator on American politics with credentials unmatched by anyone except other members of this panel. He can be seen Saturday nights as the moderator of CNN's The Capitol Gang and Friday nights on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. Since 1979, Mark has written a syndicated column on politics for the Washington Post, and in 1989, the Political Almanac named Mark Shields and David Gergen, whom I will introduce in a moment, as the best television pundits of the 1988 presidential election. A reviewer of his book on the campaign trail wrote that, quote, Mark Shields is one of the wittiest political analysts around, and he is frequently the most trenchant, fair-minded, and thoughtful. Dee Dee Myers is the first woman and the youngest person ever to serve as the White House press secretary. She joined Bill Clinton's campaign in 1991 and went on to stardom in the Clinton White House, where from my lowly position in the State Department, I watched her win the respect of the world's toughest press corps with her sharp political instincts, her great sense of humor, and her knack for explaining complicated things in straightforward language. Before the Clinton administration, Dee Dee served as press secretary for Dianne Feinstein and worked on the presidential campaign of Michael Dukakis and Walter Mondale. She is currently a contributing editor to Vanity Fair and a consultant to NBC's West Wing. Our moderator this evening is David Gergen, who has been a highly visible player on the American political scene for nearly 3 decades, spending a third of this time in the White House as advisor to 4 presidents, Nixon, Ford, Reagan, and Clinton. David currently serves as editor-at-large of U.S. News and World Report, which he helped revitalize as editor from 1984 to 93 before returning to government in the Clinton White House. He is also a professor of public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. David is a much sought-after television commentator and appears regularly on the PBS NewsHour. His earliest claim to fame, I should add, in the media came when he was managing editor of the Yale Daily News when I first got to know him, along with other up-and-coming Yale students of that era like Joe Lieberman, John Kerry, Bill Clinton, and, of course, George W. Bush. Please join me in welcoming to the stage of the Kennedy Library David Broder, Mark Shields, Dee Dee Myers, and David Gerken.
Thank you, John Shattuck, and thank you very much indeed for bringing intellectual vitality to this institution, and I think over time creating Boston's best public forum. It's so nice to have a place in Boston where everybody can come and you've really done that. I congratulate you on that. It's been a wonderful. I want to thank all of you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here. We're delighted to have some students from the Kennedy School who have come over here to the Kennedy Library. Before we turn to the film clips and discuss advertising, it seemed appropriate that we might pause a moment to let each of these members of the panel offer a few words about someone who has been very near and dear to them and has recently died, and a native of this city, Mary McGrory. And so if we might, David Broder, you were her friend, her colleague at the Washington Post, and wrote a column that is about her after her death that people are still talking about. Perhaps you could say a few words about Mary and Dee Dee and then Mark. That'd be great.
Well, all of us have our own favorite memories, but this city has given America many great gifts over the years, but certainly in my generation, no greater gift for journalism than Mary McGrory. We started working together 44 years ago when I joined her at the old Washington Star, and I can honestly say that there was nobody in my lifetime who set a higher standard for journalism than Mary McGrory in 2 respects. First of all, she could write rings around everybody else in the business. And second, because right up until a year ago, when a stroke stopped her, she could also outwork everybody. Mary was 85 when she died 10 days ago, and well into her 80s, she was out on the beat every single day. She only knew one way to cover stories, and that was to be there, watching and asking the questions herself. She was not somebody who relied on C-SPAN or the internet to know what was going on. Mary was an old-fashioned shoe leather reporter, and as such, she was a model to everybody else in the business.
Dee Dee?
I didn't know Mary nearly as well as David and Mark, but I certainly did come to know her when I was at the White House, and I was amazed by how often I would see her. Because so many columnists you read but you don't see, but Mary you would see, and that wasn't always a good thing. Mary sometimes came to share her 2 cents with you about you, or about your, more often in my case, about my boss. Just because she was a liberal didn't mean she was going to put up with much from the likes of Bill Clinton. So I admired that very much about her, how often I would see her, even when it wasn't pleasant. And the breadth of her interests. I continued to be friendly with Mary after I left the White House, and the last kind of column conversation I had with her was about an episode of The West Wing. So she was not only following politics in the real Washington, she was following some things that were going on television. But the thing I admired most about her was she was she didn't really consider herself a feminist, but she was a model for a lot of women. She was covering real news in an era when a lot of women weren't, and writing columns in an era when no women were. And yet she managed to do it all without ever carrying her own suitcase.
That's right.
And I know every man on this stage
Absolutely.
can testify to how many times they carried her suitcases, and they weren't small suitcases. So she will be greatly missed for a lot of reasons.
Mark.
David, Dee Dee and David said, I just want to underline, Mary was a friend in addition to being a colleague. And David's absolutely right. She was a shoe leather reporter. She haunted committee hearings. She talked to the lowliest witnesses appearing. She once said she considered herself to be a psychiatric social worker because all those who felt left out, put upon, downtrodden were her natural constituency. And one of Mary's favorite quotes was from Thomas à Kempis, St. Thomas à Kempis, who said, "Fawn not upon the great," and she never did. She didn't go to have private, too many, certainly not David, but certainly too many columnists do, the private lunch with the cabinet secretary. That was not Mary's style at all. And in addition to that, in addition to writing like a song and reporting endlessly, she also had a very human side. Her life's work were the abused, neglected, and abandoned children of St. Anne's Maternity and Orphanage Home in Washington. And she forced more of her friends. You couldn't write a check. I mean, that wasn't enough. I mean, you had to go there and spend time with these children, all of whom Mary knew their name, she knew their case history, and she cared about them. She once said to me that nobody, and not to me alone, nobody in life can get too much encouragement. So that's there's going to be a fundraiser in Washington next month for St. Anne's, and it was her love and her passion, and in addition, it was her love for the underdog was not in the abstract.
You can see, I think, not only why Mary McGrory was such a beloved figure in Washington, but also the quality of people we have here tonight. And I think we're very fortunate to have this panel. And what could be said about Mary is always going to the scene and being there can also be said about our journalists here and David Broder and Mark Shields. One of the things I've admired about them is for year after year after year, they're there. They go out there, they watch, they talk, they know, they go into small places, and they really understand it. It's becoming a rarity in politics. So we have people who really understand politics, lived it, breathed it. Dee Dee has been just part of this scene now here for the last decade plus. You're up to a dozen years in the Washington scene now.
Yeah,
no. So it's a very, very distinguished panel to talk about what we're going to be seeing with some of these ads. We're going to show a set of 3 ads from different campaigns early, and then have a short discussion, and then have three or four more, and then have a little short discussion, and then 3 or 4 more, and have a little short discussion. Then talk among ourselves for a few minutes about how ads have evolved over time. And then we'll open this up to your questions and thoughts. But we're going to stretch all the way back to the first, and I think immediately we'll see that there has been some evolution in the nature of television advertising for political campaigns. Why don't we roll, if we could, with 1952 and Dwight Eisenhower.
Eisenhower Answers America.
They say we've never had it so good. Yet I've had to stop buying eggs. They're so expensive.
No wonder. You actually pay 100 different taxes on just one egg. We must cut costs, which means we must cut taxes. Eisenhower Answers America.
General, how would you clean up the mess in Washington?
My answer? It's not a one-agency mess, or even a one-department mess. It's a top-to-bottom mess. And I promise we will clean it up from top to bottom. Eisenhower Answers America.
Can you cut taxes, Mr. Eisenhower?
We can and will, if you help. Taxes have gone up steadily for 15 years. The Democrats say they must go up still more. Help me put the lid on crazy government spending.
And then a young lady asked the senator this question.
You would be divided between two loyalties to your church and to your state if you were to be elected president.
The question is whether I think that if I were elected president, I would be divided between two loyalties, my church and my state. Let me just say that I would not. I have sworn to uphold the Constitution in the 14 years I've been in Congress, in the years I was in the service. The Constitution provides in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no laws abridging the freedom of religion. I must say I believe in it. I think it's the only way that this country can go ahead. Many countries do not believe in it. Many countries have unity between church and state. I would be completely opposed to it. And I say that whether I'm elected president or whether I continue as a senator or whether I'm a citizen. That is my view based on a long experience. So in answer to your question, I would fulfill my oath of office, as I have done for 14 years in the Congress. There is no article of my faith that would in any way inhibit. I think it encourages the meeting of my oath of office. And whether you vote for me or not, because of my competence to be president, I am sure that here in this state of West Virginia, that no one believes that I'd be a candidate for the presidency if I didn't think I could meet my oath of office. Secondly, Article 6 of the Constitution says there shall be no religious test for office. That's what was written in the Constitution. Jefferson, Washington, and all the rest. They said every American will have an opportunity. Now, you cannot tell me that the day I was born it was said I can never run for president because I wouldn't meet my oath of office. I came to the state of West Virginia, which has fewer numbers of my co-religionists than any state in the Union. I would not have come here if I didn't feel that I was going to get complete opportunity to run for office as a fellow American in this state. I would not run for it if in any way I didn't feel that I could do the job. So I come here today saying that I think that this is an issue which not be. Thank you.
And there it is. Senator Kennedy answering the questions that are on your mind. Answers that should lead you to decide that here is the man to support for president. It's up to you. Vote Kennedy, May 10th.
Every Republican politician wants you to believe that Richard Nixon is, quote, experienced. They even want you to believe that he has actually been making decisions in the White House. But listen to the man who should know best, the President of the United States. A reporter recently asked President Eisenhower this question about Mr. Nixon's experience.
I just wondered if you could give us an example of a major idea of his that you had adopted in that role as the decider and final.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember. Because
At the same press conference, President Eisenhower said,
no one can make a decision except me.
and as for any major ideas from Mr. Nixon,
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember.
President Eisenhower could not remember, but the voters will remember. For real leadership in the 60s, help elect Senator John F. Kennedy president.
Well, it does bring back memories. David, you broke into journalism in the 1960 campaign, or was it right around then, wasn't it?
Yeah, 1960 was the first one I covered.
1960. Can you all hear with that microphone?
What do I need to do? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
The 1960 was the first one you covered.
Right.
Yeah. And so when you see these ads, well, starting with Eisenhower, but what memories does it bring back about political advertising and how different it was then?
Brings back a lot of memories, but I think what's relevant for our discussion was that it was a rudimentary art form, and I think on the margins in terms of its impact. I was surprised to see that Kennedy ad from West Virginia. That was the first primary the old Washington Star sent me out on, and there was a lot going on in West Virginia, but I don't remember ever seeing that ad on the air in West Virginia, and I think it was much more the personal appearances of the candidates there, Kennedy and Humphrey, who were contesting in that primary, that had to do with the outcome than any ad that was run during that during that campaign.
Oh, that's interesting.
Obviously, in the general election, it was the debates much more than the ads that were run for either Nixon or Kennedy that really influenced public opinion.
Did the candidates give speeches on television as well, or were the debates what really carried it?
No, I think they gave a lot of formal speeches, which were then covered on the television news programs along with the press. But television news at that point was 15 minutes a night, not 30 minutes. So people were learning about what the candidates were saying, partly from television news broadcasts, but I think only in a minimal way from the television ads.
That's interesting. Any other thoughts here before we roll on?
Just mention that you can see, well, by 1960, 95% of American homes had televisions, and you can see the importance of television and the effectiveness of a candidate like Kennedy and the emerging importance of looking good on television. So by the mid-1960s, people recognized that television as a political medium was here to stay.
Yeah, it was interesting in the negative ad that Kennedy ran. The picture of Nixon was from the debate.
And he was looking side slant, shifty-eyed, and even then picking the worst possible picture of your opponent. But clearly, the 52 ads with Eisenhower wouldn't have worked in a later age when people were getting more information from television.
Right.
The only thing, the cinema verite was the style that a lot of TV people used. The Eisenhower was a lot more cinema than it was verite. I mean, it was so staged and so contrived and so obvious. But what struck me most of all was how little the messages changed in 50 years. I mean, I can remember Ronald Reagan, covering Ronald Reagan, where he said 247 taxes on a loaf of bread.
I remember you had a fight.
And there were not 247 taxes. We went looking one day, we couldn't find them. But 100 taxes on just an egg, I guess that's 1,200 on a dozen or whatever. And then Jack Kennedy talking about church and state, and you got Cardinal Lorenzi and John Kerry right now. So that one hasn't gone away either. I had never seen the "If You Give Me a Week" before, and I knew the quote and everything else. I didn't realize how effectively they'd used. I mean, as negative commercials go, that's about as good as you can get when you've got Dwight Eisenhower as your attack vehicle.
Okay, let's roll on. The first ad is one of the most famous in television history, and I believe was only shown once. We'll talk about that. But the second ad is the one I enjoy a lot. And we have four here, stretching from 64 through 1976.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
I was here when Carter was governor, and he made a lot of promises that he didn't keep.
He increased the number of government employees in the state of Georgia substantially while he was in office. And I don't know if that helped us or hurt us, but I know it definitely increased the budget. When you increase the budget, you have to increase the tax base.
Well, when I tell people here in Georgia that I'm going to vote for Ford, they don't really understand why. It would be good to have a president from Georgia, but not Carter. He's just an honest man. If he were my father, I'd love him. He's just that type of a person. I trust him.
I'm voting for Ford because I trust him and I think he's a decent man.
I like the man. I have faith in the man. I trust the man. I think he's an honest man, and that's the kind of guy that I want representing me.
President Gerald Ford really does things for the people.
He's looking out for the man on the street, for the average person.
He's the best president we had, and he's going to be the best president we are going to have. I like him very much. He's a very honest man.
Well, then I just like his honesty. I like his views.
He's about the most straightforward man I know. His policies are sound. I'm very pleased with the direction he's taken the country since the Nixon days.
He's just a downright decent, honest person, it seems to me.
I feel that President Ford is the best man to lead us forward.
David Broder, coming back to the Daisy ad, that first ad. As I recall, that was only shown once.
That is right.
And then they pulled it, but it did have the intended effect.
It became the total topic of conversation and discussion, and it was a devastatingly effective ad, and probably the cheapest ad that anybody ever had. A striking thing about this is that we start in 64 and go through 76, but you can see the tremendous change that's taken place, because in none of those ads that we just saw do you actually see the candidate. And what's happened now is that the advertising people have decided you can sell a candidate as if you were selling any other commodity, by testimonials or by pure symbolism, as in the Daisy ad. You don't have to risk making the candidate himself do his own sales.
That was Tony Schwartz who made that?
Yes.
What, do you remember the circumstances, Mark?
Well, I mean, it never mentioned Barry Goldwater's name.
Yeah.
I mean, in that ad. I mean, which made it even more devastating. I mean, it led the viewer had to conclude that it was Goldwater they were talking about, and Johnson's voice about we either all love each other or we perish. I was the laughing commercial, which the audience got a big reaction from on Agnew, reminded me that nobody votes for vice president. Probably the most compelling case you could make for vice president was Michael Dukakis' choice of Lloyd Bentsen in 1988 against Dan Quayle. I mean, he totally vanquished him and probably, permanently disabled Quayle as a serious political figure in that debate, and yet he couldn't carry his home state, and Bentsen couldn't, and made a significant difference. And I guess Agnew and Quayle were probably the two most dubious choices for vice president I can recall, and yet both nominees won. So I would caution, even though it's inviting to do that. The other thing that hit me, I thought Jerry Ford's campaign in 1976 was the best political television I have ever seen up till this moment, including this moment. I mean, it was a wonderful message, and you heard that song in the second one, I'm Feeling Good About America. You understand, this is the end of Vietnam and Watergate, and the Ford message was essentially, he's not Abraham Lincoln, he's not FDR, but he's not Richard Nixon, he's not LBJ either. I mean, that was the message that came through, and about what a decent man. Everything they said was true. The argument basically was Jerry Ford's the old shoe. Jimmy Carter's a new suit. You're not really sure of him, and that's why we want these people from Georgia to tell you what they know about him. And it was the most remarkable comeback in American political history. He was 32 points down in the polls on Labor Day. He came within a switch of 14,000 votes in two states, Iowa and Mississippi, from beating Jimmy Carter. It was an amazing, amazing achievement. And it was all on television, because the campaign itself, he was liberating Poland in the second debate, you recall. I mean, which was just, totally unhelpful. It was, and they were arguing about Clarence Kelly, the FBI's director, drapes and valences. I mean, it was not a big issue campaign. So the campaign was on television.
Yeah, but that was Doug Bailey and John Deerdorf.
Doug Bailey and John Deerdorf, and it was a great campaign. And Stu Spencer, and David's right. Stu Spencer, who later was Ronald Reagan, previous, and then later was Ronald Reagan's advisor, had to go to Jerry Ford and say, that's when Ford did his Rose Garden strategy, never really went out campaigning. He said, Mr. President, you are a disaster when you go out. He's more graphic language, which I'll save the tender ears of the people in this room. And this is to Jerry Ford, who had done 300 chicken dinners a year on behalf of Republican candidates. Everywhere you go, you cause points. You're a terrible candidate, but you're a great president. You're going to stay in the Rose Garden. And that's how they ran that campaign. And they ran it essentially on television and what he did officially as president at that time.
Yeah, it was also true that that was one of the last moderate campaigns on the Republican side.
That's right. That's right.
That was very much appealing to the center. It was not.
Yes.
It was a very, and Betty Deardorff came to represent that. Doug Bailey, by the way, has gone on to invent the hotline in politics and has been involved with a number of efforts to improve the quality of politics. And John Deardorff went off to do a lot of things about pro-choice and issues. But they found after that, I think they found themselves increasingly stranded in Republican politics in terms of.
Howard Baker was their last one.
Yes.
In 1980.
Right. Dee Dee?
Just a couple thoughts. The Daisy ad was, I think, subsequent documents have proved that it was designed specifically to be shown one time and to drive a conversation. It was shown on NBC during the movie The Week in September of that year, and it subsequently made the cover of Time magazine and a number of other places, so it did generate a huge conversation. And what struck me about some of these ads was how not only the themes are the same, but the tactics repeat themselves, because we saw the same thing in 1988 against Governor Dukakis. Here, the Willie Horton ad, which we'll see, only aired one time. But that was incredibly effective, and it obviously was, it reminded people that Barry Goldwater had said things like he was in favor of using tactical nuclear weapons. And, you know, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. So it sort of reminded people about their fears of Goldwater. The Humphrey ad is hilarious. Everyone laughs. But I don't think those ads, my sort of reading is they're not particularly effective. And, again, we saw that one echoed during the Dukakis campaign when they did one of about Dan Quayle with just the whole ad was just focused on the Oval Office, basically saying, can you know, 1 in 5 vice presidents has gone on to be president. So you see this thing about, oh, we got to be terrified of this guy who's vice president, but they don't really have that much effect because, like as Mark said, people don't really vote for vice president. And I think those ads sort of underscore the difference between the elites in Washington and what they think is scary or funny and what the people at home are thinking about. So I don't think those are particularly effective. As for the Ford ads, what I was struck at in that whole campaign, looking back at some of it, was how both of those candidates were trying in the aftermath of Watergate. It was all about character, and both of their ad campaigns focused so intensely on this is a good man. He has good values, and when push comes to shove, he'll be for you. And both campaigns parallel those two things, and I think some of Ford's gaffes and his association with pardoning Nixon clearly cost him that election because they were two good men. Ford had more experience at a time when the world was still in the midst of the Cold War, but a few mistakes cost him, and his association with Nixon cost him the election.
Yeah. We're going to move on now to our final brace of ads. To pay particular attention, if you might, this time, because we'll come back and talk about it, to the ads from the 1988 campaign that were very much the product of Roger Ailes and Lee Atwater. And we'll talk a little bit about the connection between those ads and what we're seeing today, because there's some interesting parallels. So we'll run these.
It's morning again in America. Today, more men and women will go to work than ever before in our country's history. With interest rates and inflation down, more people are buying new homes, and our new families can have confidence in the future. America today is prouder and stronger and better. Why would we want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
Michael Dukakis has opposed virtually every defense system we developed. He opposed new aircraft carriers. He opposed anti-satellite weapons. He opposed 4 missile systems, including the Pershing II missile deployment. Dukakis opposed the stealth bomber and the ground emergency warning system against nuclear attack. He even criticized our rescue mission to Grenada and our strike on Libya. And now he wants to be our commander-in-chief. America can't afford that risk.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
I was born in a little town called Hope, Arkansas, 3 months after my father died. I remember that old two-story house where I lived with my grandparents. They had very limited incomes. It was in 1963 that I went to Washington and met President Kennedy at the Boys Nation program. And I remember just thinking what an incredible country this was, that somebody like me, you know, had no money or anything, would be given the opportunity to meet the president. That's when I decided that I could really do public service because I cared so much about people. I worked my way through law school with part-time jobs, anything I could find. And after I graduated, I really didn't care about making a lot of money. I just wanted to go home and see if I could make a difference. We've worked hard in education and healthcare to create jobs, and we've made real progress. Now it's exhilarating to me to think that as president, I could help to change all our people's lives for the better and bring hope back to the American dream.
Make that mistake.
But if the charge is lying, can you say that neither you nor President Clinton has told a lie in your political career?
None spring to mind, I'll tell you that. And let me say again.
And President Clinton has not uttered a single untruth in the last 2 years?
Not that I have heard, absolutely not. And again, Lisa, let me say that...
Not a single one?
Well, yes.
None have told a lie?
Well, look, Lisa...
ouch. Is that what you said? Yeah, right. Wow, we covered a lot of ground in those ads. Let's go. David Broder, I always felt that Reagan ad, Good Morning in America, was a wonderful ad, but it was content-free in terms of his... as opposed to his 1980 campaign when he campaigned and got a mandate for change on specifics. His 1984 campaign was his feel-good campaign, and it helped win a big election, but left him without a mandate.
That is such a picky. I thought the idea was to win the election, and clearly that's what Reagan and Jim Baker and the others thought where they were doing. That was a perfect ad for that year because America was finally feeling relief from the humiliation of the hostage crisis, the inflation that was tied to the energy crisis. It took a while because there was a recession in the first year and a half of the Reagan administration. But by the time we got to 83 and 84, Americans were feeling for the first time that they could actually make some plans for their own family and their own future that wouldn't be disrupted by external events. And that ad captured the public mood perfectly. And I thought it was just a superb ad. Mm-hmm. Did not create a mandate for any particular governance. And second terms often turn out, as you know, David, better than I, not to have much in the way of an agenda or a mandate to them.
Right. I remember Ed Rollins the day of the election, the day after the election, and he wanted to go out after the 84 election. He wanted to go out and claim a mandate, and Baker said, "You can't do it. You just can't do it because of that." Mark?
I think the first ingredient that all TV spots ought to be tested on is their truth, and that was true in that Morning in America spot. It was people did feel better. Ronald Reagan had repurchased the nation's optimism, and you have to recall that in the campaign of 1980, there were serious scholars. I mean, even those appearing on the op-ed page of the New York Times and the Washington Post and such distinguished journals saying the presidency is too big a job for one man. We ought to have one single 6-year term, that no president should have to seek re-election, because the problems, the word was intractable. And what Ronald Reagan did, in addition to purchasing our optimism, was he purged the word intractable from the nation's vocabulary. There was nobody, there's a longer version of that spot was said, which the narrator says, interesting that no one anywhere is saying the job of president is too big for one person. And it was absolutely true. And there was no, it laid the predicate to seek a mandate. It obviously wasn't mandate seeking in itself. Reagan was seen as having failed. Harris poll at the time, how he was dealing with the Soviets, he had failed. Dealing with El Salvador, he had failed. The environment had failed. Helping the needy, controlling defense spending, had failed in voters' judgment and all that. And the micro test, but on the macro test of the presidency and how the nation itself, felt about him, and felt the optimism, Ronald Reagan decided to run on a macro level, and that was something that his opponents couldn't match.
Didi, I wonder if we could skip all the way over to the Clinton and Gore ads, and I want to come back to the 88 if we could. To see that Clinton ad brought back a lot of memories. How effective was that first Clinton ad, the Man from Hope?
I think it was a terrific introduction. I mean, keeping in mind that people didn't know much about Bill Clinton when they saw that. And I think the image of him shaking hands with President Kennedy in the Rose Garden was tremendously powerful, and Bill Clinton talking about his own experience with that. But now through the prism of all we know, you see him and he says, and I think, you know, what a great country this is that I could shake the hand of a president, and it made me think that I could make a career in public service. When you know what he meant to say was, I could be president. So it's a great moment, but and it reminded me of all the hope that was infused in the early part of the '92 campaign when Bill Clinton seemed like he really might change the world. And I think that the ads throughout that campaign were tremendously effective. And one of the things we've seen is when candidates are good on television, the ad people use the candidates, and Clinton was good on television.
That's interesting. And they could use Gore very effectively against him.
Against himself?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it was, that's devastating. That's painful to watch now, and you think that there's nothing else they need to say, which is why all they have is the simple television sitting there in the kitchen and thinking, people thinking, you're watching this in your kitchen, this man cannot be president.
Yeah, now let me then juxtapose the 88 versus 92. It seems to me that what we're now seeing in this campaign is very much like what we saw in '88. I mean, the advertisement about John Kerry on defense seems almost a son of that ad about he cut this, he cut that, or he voted against this, he voted against that. There's no John Kerry in the tank. But John Kerry's been unable to get a Man from Hope kind of ad on.
Right. Well, he did have in Iowa, I think, some of the testimonials from his Vietnam comrades, which were tremendously effective. I think that they were out of the same genre. But I think this Bush campaign used Kerry's words against him in a similar way when he said, well, actually, I voted for the $87 billion before I voted against it. And I think one of the most damaging things can be people using their own words or their bosses, in Eisenhower's case, his words against them. And that doesn't need any explanation. It doesn't need any more words. The viewers see it for themselves, and the advertisers know how incredibly powerful that is. People make their own judgments.
Right. Well, since we're not going to be watching any ads from this campaign, I wonder if you all could describe what we're seeing. David, do you see some parallel between the '88 and what's happening now with the anti-Kerry ads? Because I see a sense of, here's Lee Atwater running the '88 campaign and then running the Willie Horton and then running that tank ad. And now here's his protege, Karl Rove, running ads which have some echo.
Some echo. I would say it's right off of the same playbook.
Yeah.
The thing that struck me looking at the tank ad is that we think about the tank ad as making fun of Michael Dukakis' stature and appearance, but that the real message of that ad was what was being scrolled over those the picture there about his alleged weakness on weapons policy, and we are certainly seeing that again used against John Kerry. What is absent, and what's exactly the point you were going to with Didi, Kerry has not as yet found a narrative of his own life or a link between his own life and where the country is at the moment that is anything that could be communicated through this sort of visual shorthand of a television commercial. When we see John Kerry on television, he is talking in a very objective way about an external reality. But he hasn't linked himself to that story in any respect so far, and whether they can find that is something, we'll find out over the next 6 months or so.
Mark?
Better find out in the next 3 months, David. I mean, because if it isn't found by the 1st of August, it's not going to be found. But I agree. I agree with both Didi and David. I would say this race between Kerry and George W. Bush strikes me very much as a race between George W. Bush and George Herbert Walker Bush. The parallels with John Kerry and George Herbert Walker Bush, I think, are striking. Young man, great courage as a young man, and spent the rest of their life wanting to become president, not identified with any defining issue or overarching mission in their public life. And in a strange way, I think that's part of what is lacking in the Kerry candidacy right now. That's why the Vietnam experience is so important. Those of us who covered the primaries, it was a different John Kerry we saw in the company of his comrades than it was the rest of the time. And the rest of the time, he sounded like a précis from Congressional Quarterly. I was a co-sponsor in the motion to recommit, but we tabled the motion to recommit, and as the eyes just glaze over. But in the company of those with whom he served, and to hear their testimonials about him, I mean, you can see the effect upon the audience, but you can see the effect, more importantly, upon John Kerry. I think one change between '88 and this year, and it's an important one, it was in the McCain-Feingold bill. McCain-Feingold, I should say me and Shays as well here in Massachusetts and New England. And that is that now we have the tagline that the president himself, or the presidential candidate, has to say, "I approved of this ad." And I think, in a strange way, it's going to lead to greater accountability and perhaps a more, less of a scorched earth campaign than the one that we saw in 1988 against Michael Dukakis. Because even though you've got a narrator and a voice, it's still at the beginning of the end. It says John Kerry or George W. Bush saying, "I approved of this ad." That's in the law now. The candidate has to appear, not in little tiny print that looks like the back of an insurance policy that was sold somewhere in Nova Scotia, paid for by. So I think that's a difference, and it's a salutary and positive difference, I think, or somewhat of a governor.
Did you do a double take on that, David?
Yes, I think that's very optimistic, Mark, to think that right. The disclaimer is going to improve the content of the ads. As long as the consultants can convince the candidates that going negative on your opponent moves the numbers more effectively than anything positive you can say about yourself, I think we are sentenced to this kind of sleazy advertising that we're seeing again in this campaign.
I just add, not to, by way of response, I think we in the press have done a lousy job of covering television ads. I really do. I think television news has done a miserable job. And I would hope that when they appear on Meet the Press or Face the Nation or George Stephanopoulos or any place else, that they'll have the imagination to put up an ad and say, "Now tell us, you just spent Mr. Bush or Mr. Kerry, $15 million. You had the attention of the American people. You said, this is the most important message I want to get out. Whether it's George Bush double parked outside an orphanage on Christmas Eve or whatever the hell, he ripped the tag off the mattress in violation of federal law, or, whatever else. That you really, because this is the most important message of every campaign. This is it. Forget the speech to the VFW or the Little Sisters of the Poor or anybody else. This is the campaign. And this is where they devote their time, their resources, and they ought to be held accountable. And candidates ought to ask each other. I mean, you'd hope that a national debate that George Bush would run that 30-second spot and say, John Kerry, do you really believe that? Because it should be part of the campaign. And once you've got the disclaimer in there where the candidate himself does endorse it and approve it, I think his accountability can't be denied. He can't do as the Bush people did in '88 and say, oh, that was an independent expenditure, as was done on the original.
But the thing is that they can, because what's happened in the wake of campaign finance reform is soft money was eliminated, and all that money is now flowing into these unregulated 527s, which are independent expenditure committees. We don't have, no one has to disclose who's giving them money or exactly how they're spending it, and they're going to have no bones about running Willie Horton-style ads if that's what it comes down to. Remember, Willie Horton was created and financed and run one time by an independent expenditure.
Yeah, well, this was an independent ad. I mean, it was not run. This was not a campaign ad. It was run by an independent person.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It was, and Roger Ailes said, "Don't know anything about it. Never heard of it. Never saw it." But it only ran once, and yet it's had a tremendous impact on politics. So I sadly disagree that campaign. I mean, it might make Bush's ads a little bit, or Kerry's ads a little bit different. I think the other thing that's happened in the wake of campaign finance reform is that the candidates have blown the caps, and so what we've seen is John Kerry raising more money than any challenger to a president ever, and President Bush breaking every conceivable record. We couldn't have even imagined this much money a few years ago. And John Kerry just today announced that he was going to be spending $25 million in the next 3 weeks on his campaign. He's got 2 new spots, $25 million in 3 weeks,
wow.
Which is a staggering amount of money.
Help us all understand this. Why are people going so early with these big blitzes? I mean, the newspapers were full this weekend of, as much as $90 million has already been spent, and we're months away from this election. Why so early, and why has advertising come? David said at the beginning of this that in the first ads, how marginal advertising was back then. And now Marcus said how central it is today. And why so early, and why has advertising come to dominate the way our political discourse?
Well, I take a shot at it. First thing is you have total control. I mean, that's what advertising is. It's the message that the candidate and the campaign want to deliver. They don't have to worry about being filtered through any other medium, the press, print, or TV, or anything. And plus, you can speak to everybody at the same time, which is one of the better things about television and television advertising, is that you have to assume that every ad you put on, your opponents are going to see. That wasn't the way it was with direct. It isn't the way it is with direct mail. It isn't the way historically it was. I think what we have is 2 candidates running earlier campaigns. George W. Bush is running the 1992 campaign of his father. He's convinced, or at some level, there's a conviction that his father lost because he broke his word on taxes and because he angered the cultural religious right of his party, and leading to a challenge by Pat Buchanan, and that's cost him re-election. So his presidency and his political message has been devoted to assuring that neither of those things happen. John Kerry is influenced by Michael Dukakis. Okay? That Michael Dukakis had a 16-point lead coming out of Paul Kirk's convention in Atlanta in 1988. Best convention the Democrats ever had, by the way. And the heroin was put in the bloodstream about Michael Dukakis. I mean, and the Gipper himself at a press conference talking about whether he'd had a nervous breakdown, and I shouldn't attack an invalid. I shouldn't criticize an invalid. So they just started planting this stuff, and the feeling was that Dukakis did not fight back, and it crystallized, obviously, in the Bernie Shaw question in the debate. What would you do you know, if somebody, position on capital punishment, if somebody raped and murdered Kitty Dukakis, and Dukakis managed to turn it into, I have great respect for Michael Dukakis, but managed to turn it into an international commission on drug laws, meaning in the Caribbean, that ought to be held. And, you know, you're just dying for somebody to stand up. I want to kill the son of a bitch with my own hands. That's what I'd want to do. And but, you know, because I'd think of Kitty, I wouldn't do it because I remember her memory and I know that this isn't the answer, or however they do it. And the point was because he didn't, and now I mean, John Kerry's going to answer every slight. And if they're spending $25 million on the 2 commercials I've seen, wow. I mean, gee, the one was just a litany of the 3 things he's interested in doing. I mean, there wasn't any emotional connection in him. Maybe the other one's gangbusters. Let's hope.
David, why so early, and why has advertising become so front and center?
Well, I think Mark's explained the dynamic of what's in the back of their minds. But the other thing that's moved it early is the fact that despite the noble efforts of McCain, Feingold, and their partners up here in New England, the money chase has accelerated and not slowed down, as Dee Dee pointed out. And if you give that much money to people who make money out of putting ads on the air, they're going to persuade the candidates that it's damn well time to start getting the ads on the air. There is one small, slight counter trend, which may, over time, give us some relief from some of this. As the television spectrum has divided into smaller pieces, there are now beginning to be some doubts about how effective television advertising is. And the parties are rediscovering the virtues of two-way communication, which basically means going back to the future of old-fashioned precinct work. Started with organized labor, was picked up by the Democrats. The Republicans saw that in states like Iowa and Wisconsin, they lost the states because they got outworked on the ground. So now the Republicans have moved in with all of the resources that they command to try to do precinct work again. Precinct work is much healthier for our politics because it actually conveys a message to the person whose door is being knocked on that they have an active role that they can play if they choose to in the campaign. They're not sitting back on the couch having the campaign roll over them unwillingly there. It makes them participants potentially instead of just spectators.
Yeah, Didi, I had the impression as well that this early advertising was something that Clinton did in '96 to great effect, that he basically carpet bombed Bob Dole before Dole was ever get his campaign off the ground, and Dole never was able to get any altitude.
Right. He did both. He did two. Clinton decided to start early. In '95, he started airing commercials, and people thought that was a very risky strategy to spend what money he had. And he did two things. One, he reinforced his own accomplishments, and two, as David said, he carpet bombed Bob Dole. And it turned out to be very effective. I mean, the Dole campaign, for reasons have nothing to do with Clinton, never really found their footing, but that certainly is something that people remember, and that I think Karl Rove, among other people, remembers. I think there's another reason. So I think certainly the Bush campaign is doing some of that, but they didn't really start advertising, partly because of the ongoing war, until February when, and I think that was partly generated by the Democrats' decision to condense the primary schedule. And so what we basically had was the entire Democratic primary happened between, late January and the beginning of March. It happened in 5 or 6 weeks. And all of a sudden it was March 2nd, and we had a general election. We knew who the nominee was going to be, and we knew who the president was obviously going to be the Republican nominee. And so there was sort of no reason for the Bush people to hold back. They knew they would have $200 million if they needed it, and they wanted to take Kerry out before he ever really got his sea legs. And they did a pretty effective job, $60 million already in mostly negative ads. But I think, one of the things about we have all these 500 channels means that sophisticated advertisers will just micro-target. And one of the things the Bush campaign has done is looked for their constituency, which for one group that they do very well is white men who watch a lot of sports, and so they buy a lot of ESPN and things like that. They've been able to reach Lee Shields, who's, he's obviously their prime target. No, but seriously, now you can really just, any demographic group you want to reach, you can do that through television. So I think it's both a combination of the calendar and the money and strategy.
We're going to go to the floor here in just a minute, but I do have to ask, Mark, is this a $90 million with 24.5 more coming on top of this soon? Is this a healthy way to elect a president?
Depends on the president we end up with, I guess. It was broken. Just review the bidding. I mean, George W. Bush decided with no opponent. It wasn't like in 2000. He just decided to raise whatever they could. They doubled the limits, and so they decided to double the pot. And they went from pioneers to rangers to sheriffs. I don't know. They've got they got all these categories. Wyatt Earps, whatever. They raised. And so the Democrats. Howard Dean changed campaign financing this year. Let's be very blunt about it. I mean, Howard Dean proved you can raise a lot of money not dependent upon the traditional, conventional givers of $2,000 checks. And he proved that, hundreds of thousands of people were willing to write small checks. And once that was gone, Kerry then was given a chance to compete by mortgaging one of their small properties in the trailer park, and the key is once John Kerry, whoever got the Democratic nomination in 2004, was going to sit under a waterfall of money. You have to understand that George W. Bush has a more unfavorable rating among members of the other party than any president in the history of the Gallup poll. Okay? Fewer Democrats give George Bush a positive rating than Republicans gave Bill Clinton a favorable rating. Wow. 1/2 as many have a positive feeling about George Bush as did about Ronald Reagan. 18% fewer than Richard Nixon. So it was whoever got it. It could have been, Mickey Glotz would have been the nominee. He would have been sitting there and getting an awful lot of money. And I think, once the barrier had been broken, it was just all bets were off. And I think the Dean miracle is really what set the whole thing in motion.
All right, let's go to the floor. Your questions are welcome. The microphones are here. Sir, you have the first question.
My question relates to the coming debates between the two candidates. It appears to some people that if Kerry learns how to speak without being a radio announcer, he might warm up and beat Bush. Bush might not do quite well in a debate against Kerry, whose mind is very sharp. What do you think?
Well, Mark and I both covered the Kerry Weld race up here, and we saw how well John Kerry did in debates against a very charming, attractive, and probably more likable Republican opponent. So he's had some experience in this kind of a situation, and I don't discount that he may do very well again against President Bush. The risk, as some Democrats will tell you, is that he may do too damn well and appear to be just, sort of so patronizing toward the president that there could be a backlash against his knowledgeability.
Yeah.
And I give it to just Dee Dee, but because she's been through this personally, American voters pick presidents, and there's not a race in which the candidate counts more than the presidency. And they really feel they have an information overload about these people. And I remember Peter Hart, the wonderful Democratic pollster, ran a series of focus groups in 2000. And I was lucky enough, and David was there as well, but I was lucky enough to see him ask the same question of several groups. And they asked participants, if you were transferred from your job 60 miles from home, and you had to get back and forth in time, make your trip shorter, you had to have one of these candidates. Pat Buchanan or George W. Bush or Al Gore ride in your carpool to be in the HOV lane. And not one person ever chose Al Gore. The same time he asked, and Peter did the same groups. Remember, Regis Philbin's show was quite popular at the time. You Want to Be a Millionaire, and you had a hotline call to make if you were stumped for a question, and who would you call? And not one person mentioned George W. Bush. Okay, now I say that because I guess Al Gore, probably on points won those debates in 2000. But people decided they didn't want him in the carpool. I mean, they didn't, they really didn't want him in the living room or the kitchen or where for the next 4 years. I would say in the debate, the one time I saw Kerry in this whole campaign debate well was in New Hampshire before the New Hampshire primary, and they had imposed a limit of 1 minute on the answers, and Kerry was prevented from his preambles and his circumlocution and his wind-up delivery to end, and he was forced to give it in a minute, and he was pretty damn good. And David's right, against Bill Weld, who was had an IQ of 200 and was a lot more liked by the press and people who covered him, and was a successful politician. I mean, Kerry did take him out.
Yeah, I think, Mark, you said it so well. I would just add that everybody thought that Gore would clean the floor with George W. Bush the last time around. That didn't happen. Maybe on substance points, Gore did a little bit better, but Bush held his own. And there was the moment to me that there's always an unexpected moment in debates, and they usually have very little to do with substance, although sometimes it can be substantive. But there's a moment where voters kind of sums up how voters feel. In 1992, it was the debate where George Bush looked at his watch. They were in the middle of a town hall debate. Clinton was completely enthralled, and George Bush looked at his watch. There was a moment in the Bush-Gore debates that I thought sort of summed it all up, where Gore got up out of his chair and kind of lurked over Bush, and the thought bubble over stalked him exactly. The thought bubble over Bush's head was, "I'm going to take him outside after this debate and beat the living daylights out of him." And everybody sympathized with Bush at that moment. And so there's always an unexpected moment that sort of explains to people what non-verbally how they view these two guys, and it's important. It's why there's so much time and effort that goes into trying to take all the unpredictability out of the debates in terms of who are going to be the panelists and what's exactly the format going to be, and is it going to be limited to a minute, or are we going to let them go on? And in the end, it's out of anyone's control.
And who would you predict would win a Kerry-Bush debate?
I think Bush comes off on television at this point as so much more likable that's a big problem for Kerry. But I think the potential for Bush to make a substantive mistake, possibly, or for Kerry to make a, Gore-like lurking kind of mistake, are huge. And so I think it's definitely not a slam dunk for either of them.
So somebody ought to call the Kerry campaign and say, limit this to 1 minute answers.
And make him sit in his chair or something. Don't let him get up and walk around. And believe me, they will spend hours, days, weeks in the next couple of months before they get to the point of negotiating formats, trying to figure out how to limit the candidate's liability in every conceivable way.
One more.
The podiums.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Pardon
Go
me,
ahead.
Dee. One more testimonial to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan debated in 1984 as an incumbent president when he didn't have to. Jerry Ford had to in 1976. He was running 20 points behind Jimmy Carter. That was his only hope. He was the first time we'd had a debate since 1960. And Reagan institutionalized it. He made it permanent. He made it, now incumbents couldn't. I mean, the Bush people try and get this down to one debate.
They are?
I don't think there's any question. I mean, I think they'll try and, national.
Do you think they can get away with that?
No, but I think they'll try.
David, do you think they can get away with one debate?
I think Mark's right that they will try to have it early and single.
I think they can get away with it.
You think they can?
They don't respond to pressure from the press, and the public doesn't care that much.
Do you think they can get away with it, David? I would think they'd have to have at least two, and maybe three.
I don't know. Paul will have to arbitrate this ultimately, but I
hope
think,
I'm wrong.
Debates are not Bush's best format, and
no, you're right.
And if you're the incumbent, you hold the high cards. And, I mean, I remember very well, this is an unpolite thing to say to a Boston audience, but Paul Bronis, who is a very smart lawyer, got taken completely to the cleaners by Jim Baker in the negotiations because Baker was sitting there as the incumbent, representing the incumbent president. And he knew he had the high cards, and he used them. I can't believe that lesson has been lost on young George Bush.
The only thing I would add, though, is I'm not sure one debate is really in their interest, because then it becomes such a high-wire act that you don't have a chance to have a second opportunity. And given Bush's, this is not as great as format, they might want 2 debates just to lessen their odds.
The one caveat I would give to John Kerry going into debate with George W. Bush, knowing the names of the NATO countries and their principal products is not what this is about. And the Los Angeles Times has a wonderful 4-part question that they asked nationally at the end of last year, and they asked, which of these 4 categories do you fit into? I like George Bush personally, and I mostly agree with his policies. First A. I like George Bush personally, I mostly disagree with his policies. Then I dislike George Bush personally, mostly disagree with his policies. And then a very bizarre subgroup called I dislike George Bush personally, but mostly agree with his policies, who are about 4 or 5% of really eccentrics in the country. But what is most interesting to me is that 68% of Americans like George W. Bush. Okay? And it drives my wonderful wife of 38 years absolutely loony. She doesn't know anybody who likes George Bush and doesn't dislike George Bush and dislike his policies. And that's 20% of the electorate. So for John Kerry or any Democrat to beat George Bush, you have to somehow persuade that 28% of voters, almost a third, who like Bush personally but disagree with his policies, that his policies are enough to vote against him and to vote for the other way. I mean, there's no point in going in and belittle him or make him into Dr. Strangelove or whatever else. I mean, and those are the 20% of the people who have fueled financially the Kerry campaign. I mean, because they were still writing checks today.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm from New Hampshire, and I wanted to know your opinion on our former Governor Jeanne Shaheen and what impact she is having on Kerry's message.
Response here?
I think Jeanne Shaheen was very important to Senator Kerry in New Hampshire, because when he decided basically to pull the campaign out of New Hampshire and take his shot in Iowa, it was left to Jeanne Shaheen and her husband Bill to carry on the campaign, and they did it very well. She is a superb organizer, and she really did him great service there. I think in a national campaign where she is not a known personality, her impact is likely to be much less.
Why don't we, so we'll get through as many, why don't we go on, if we could. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being here. It's exciting. My name is Barbara, and my question is more or less a request. I was wondering what you thought of the SBG fiasco, the censorship as far as the stations that were shut down from the soldiers, the homage to the soldiers.
The Nightline.
Yeah. And how censorship will affect your job in the future. Do you think this is precedent? Thanks.
Someone want to take a crack at that and repeat the question?
Yeah. Well, the Sinclair Broadcasting in particular had 8 ABC affiliates and struck Nightline from its programs which they regularly show. They have one in Springfield, in Columbus, Ohio, St. Louis, Baltimore. And because Ted Koppel devoted the entire show to doing what Jim Lehrer does on the NewsHour every week, which is to show a photo and the hometown and the name of Americans who have died in the war. And I just thought John McCain showed why John McCain is a great national treasure. And he said, anybody who thinks about war, and he said, as someone who has supported this war and backed the president, who does not understand the sacrifice and the pain and the loss that American families are enduring, and doesn't want to honor those dead, does a disservice to this country and just eliminate those shows, was unpatriotic, he said to Sinclair Broadcasting. And I think he said it better than anything I could say.
Do you think we're going to face, or we have faced, obviously, a shutdown, and we don't see the coffins at Dover, with controversy over the photos that came out, the coffins? Are we going to see an increasing effort to hide from us those who are killed? Do you think the backlash is, do you think there's a lot of support for not bringing those to the air?
I think this administration has had its way in many ways with the press in terms of really clamping down on the amount of information that it provides on the issue of the war and the war dead, among many other issues. I thought it was quite striking that Paul Wolfowitz recently, in front of Congress, did not know the number of war dead. He was off by a count of a mere 240, I think, which was shocking. But I do think that the administration doesn't want the public to see those pictures, and they've used the families, who have some of whom have said they think that their privacy dictates that they not be shown. And I think there's probably at least a family, for every family that doesn't want the picture shown, there's another family that thinks having the country understand their sacrifice, as Mark was describing, would be a good thing.
I cannot understand why John Kerry hasn't been to funerals. The Massachusetts personnel killed. It's the president's not only commander-in-chief, the president's comforter-in-chief. And at the time of the Challenger, and I don't mean to sound like a one note for Reagan, but Reagan did speak to the nation and comfort the nation. Bill Clinton did go to Camp Lejeune after the slaying of both our diplomatic personnel, the embassy personnel. It's what a president does. And the Dover test is very simple. It was laid down by General Hugh Shelton, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2000 over at Harvard. And he said in a speech, he said, before we go into any battle, we must first face the Dover test, and that is whether we as a nation are willing to accept the caskets and the deaths in particular, but symbolically and visually in the caskets returning to Dover Air Force Base of our most valuable treasure, our young people. And if we're not, then we shouldn't go to battle. And so what has been done in this case is to obviate that question and just to skip that test. But I think, in a strange way, the only two faces we really have of Americans who've died or been hurt are Jessica Lynch and Pat Tillman, the NFL defensive back for the Arizona Cardinals. And you could see almost the administration and politicians in general being a little bit nervous about how to handle Tillman, because they wanted to pay homage to him, but you can't have it both ways. You can't ignore the others who aren't NFL players and then elevate him to the position of heroism which he obviously deserves. He won the Silver Star posthumously.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming. We hear the high cost of television is what's driving the high cost of campaigning. We hear congressmen bemoaning the fact they spend all their time going for money. We hear the fact that lobbyists bring money in order to get laws. Why doesn't Congress do something to control the cost of television ads, political ads? Or at least make it so that there is free television for politicians?
David, could you respond to that, and with also the Paul Taylor effort that's been going on?
That's a proposal that is worth applauding. I think it gets much more to the heart of our campaign finance problems, frankly, than efforts to regulate the flow of money from the private sector to the political world, which we're seeing once again end up being pretty futile. The Senate, through some act of inadvertence, actually passed a provision for low-cost television time, and the broadcast lobby, which is powerful, managed to kill it so quickly that it never saw the light of day. We were up against a very tough lobby, which has, as you know, outlets in every single congressional district all across the country, and which I think frankly intimidates a lot of members of Congress from considering seriously a proposal that actually would open up the political dialogue in this country more effectively probably than any other single step.
What about the notion of having time available to the parties toward the end of the campaign where they could actually address people in a serious way about the issues as they do in Britain? Does that have any future at all?
It runs into the same. I think it's a very useful idea that would do a great deal to change the dynamic of campaigns, potentially, but it runs into exactly the same opposition. This is a big money maker. Campaigns, as we write about them in terms of what the cost to the campaign and how much money they are collecting, that money doesn't end up in the hands of the campaign. That money ends up largely in the hands of the television industry.
David sadly is absolutely right about the power of the broadcasters' lobby and the fact that you have to understand, one of the reasons I admire Russ Feingold and John McCain and Marty Meehan and Chris Shays is that every member of Congress is an expert on two subjects. One is education, because they all went to school, and secondly is campaign financing, because they all got elected. And they don't like to tamper with a system that produced them. They think this system is divinely inspired. After all, I got elected by it. And it's no accident that the last president who really made this an issue was Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, to his everlasting credit. So it's going to take, I feel, on the question of free time, it's going to take a presidential leadership. I really do.
I think the world is changing so much, and the ways in which people get their information is changing so much. I think that there's still going to be tremendous pressure to raise money and spend it on television, but I think that efforts to, say, set aside time where America's going to sit down in front of their televisions together, that's an era that has passed us by. If the candidates are speaking at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, then every state, the cooking channel is going to put their Iron Chefs on against it. I mean, there's going to be counter-programming on the 500 other channels, and people aren't going to watch it. And so I don't think, while that's an admirable and potentially could happen, I don't think it will, and I don't think it would change things. I think what we're looking at is we're on the verge of a change in the culture and the way we get information generally. One of the things that was interesting about the Dean campaign was they raised all this money on the Internet. They didn't spend any of it on the Internet, but that's clearly the next frontier. So, if there's limits on television advertising, then that money's going to find its way onto the Internet or onto radio or into some medium we haven't yet devised. We live in a market-driven culture where money will find a way to be spent in pursuit of whatever it is people want, and if it's elective office it will be.
Yes, sir.
The last election was won on a 4-3 partisan vote by the Supreme Court. I've traveled this nation. I have not met one person that is not polarized, does not know who they're going to vote for. I don't care how much money you spend on TV. It defines what newspapers we read. It defines what television shows we watch. It defines what news, whether you watch Fox News or you watch ABC News. It defines what comedy shows we watch, whether it's Jay Leno or The Daily Show. Minds are made up. Who are we spending all of this political money for to try and convince to vote for somebody else in this election?
Such a great question.
Yeah, it is. David, you all at the Post just had a wonderful series on this, splits.
We did, and we did a focus group in St. Louis last week that gave me a couple of clues about that. There are actually people who are quite conflicted. In our group, for example, there were people who were eloquent about their concern about what they see and hear coming out of Iraq, but feel that we cannot at this point just simply pull out of Iraq. Those folks are persuadable, depending on what the candidates say, and perhaps even more on what events take place between now and November. Similarly, we had people who are poised between concern about whether there will be more jobs lost through mergers and outsourcing, or beginning to feel a little hopeful about there being more jobs created. Those folks are still on the fence.
So is it a small percentage, smaller than usual, though, who are still persuadable? Do we have a far larger percentage of the population that's made up its mind than normal?
I think that's probably correct.
Mm-hmm.
And you know,
go ahead, Mark. Go ahead, Dee Dee.
Well, I'll just add that in addition to there being a very small undecided in the middle of the spectrum, the conventional wisdom in this campaign is that this election is going to be decided in a handful of states. And already we're looking at both campaigns having target states about 18, 17, 16, and it'll shrink as time goes on. So not only is all that money being spent for a narrow universe of persuadable voters, it's going to be spent in a narrow band of states. So if you live in Ohio, you're going to be bombarded. If you live here in Massachusetts, you're probably not going to see a lot of ads.
That's right.
So, but if you're a persuadable voter in Ohio, you're nothing else is going to, you're going to see nothing else for months.
That Dee Dee's absolutely right, and as David, in this case, that they know how Massachusetts is going to vote. They know how Texas is going to vote. They know how California is going to vote, though there'll be some dodging and feinting, and they know how New York's going to vote. They know how Utah is going to vote. So the money is going to be spent in those states. So actually, in a strange way, national polling means very little in this campaign, because if George Bush is carrying Texas by 40 points, it doesn't translate into more than the electoral votes of Texas. And if John Kerry's winning Massachusetts by 40 points. The conflicted voter is the key. It's Ohio State that I'm somewhat familiar with. It's somebody who's economically pressed and leaning Democrat and probably populist in his or her economics, at the same time conflicted by what they see as the Democrats' sort of anything goes, laissez-faire on cultural and religious issues. And that's a voter that is that both sides will try and win by appeals to what the party sees, the candidate sees as strength.
And Iraq, are they conflicted over Iraq?
Yeah, they are. They are conflicted over Iraq, and I think one of the growing concerns for Kerry has to be that there is a growing movement in this country right now just to get out. I mean, it is real. I can tell you from my own interview and my own travel and reporting. I mean, it's real. And if we have another month like we had in April, in May, and if the turnover on the 1st of July goes to whoever knows who, and what new Saddam general is going to be brought back into the picture, I mean, at that point it becomes a little bit of a problem for Kerry, because I think there'll be a building represented by Ralph Nader to say, what the hell are we doing there? Let's get the hell out now. It was a bad decision to go in there. Why perpetuate? John Kerry, you said in 1971, who's going to be the last person to die for a mistake? So I think, I think it could become very conflicted.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we still have 7 months to go in this campaign, but it's hard to imagine six now. Thankfully. Yeah, that's right. I don't think we'll hear a better discussion from a better panel. Thank you, John Shattuck, for putting this together. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dee Dee Myers, Mark Shields, and David Broder.